The first thing Captain Mara Voss heard when she came back from the dead was the sound of something eating. It was a wet, rhythmic sound, patient and unhurried. And it came from somewhere beneath the wreckage of the UES Harbinger's forward observation deck. She lay on her back in a tangle of sheared conduit and shattered viewport glass, her left arm pinned under a support strut that weighed approximately the same as a small ground vehicle, and she listened to the sound for a long time before she decided that she was, in fact, alive. Her neural implant flickered, battery at 11%, suit integrity at 34%, oxygen reserves, 6 hours 40 minutes. Assuming she didn't do anything strenuous, she did a slow inventory of her body the way her first combat medic had taught her at Fort Meridian 12 years ago. Head, present. Neck, functional. Spine, aching but intact, could move. Right hand, legs. Both there, one probably fractured at the shin. She was alive. She almost wished she wasn't. The Harbinger had been a Meridian-class destroyer, one of 37 ships in the 4th Expeditionary Fleet, under Admiral Tomas Chen. Had been, past tense. She remembered the ambush with the clinical clarity that only genuine terror produces. The way the hive emergence points had opened like wounds in space, the sickly bioluminescent glow of the Vethkari broodship sliding through, the first volleys of the Spore-Lance batteries, tearing through the fleet's formation before anyone had time to do more than shout a warning. She remembered the bridge going dark. She remembered Helmsman Reyes screaming something she couldn't make out. She remembered the hull tearing open like foil. She did not remember landing, but here she was, on a planet that the Harbinger's last active sensor sweep had designated Vethkar, a former colonial world, approximately 112,000 registered inhabitants, before the hive, 3 years ago. The survey file had been 7 lines long. Colony status, lost, population unknown, hive occupation confirmed, approach not recommended. Mara Voss had never been a woman who followed recommendations. She worked her right hand into the gap between her chest and the support strut and began pushing. The strut didn't move. She pushed harder. Her suit's exo-assist kicked in, the little she had left, and the strut shifted 2 centimeters. She pushed again. Centimeter by centimeter, until she could slide her arm free, and then she lay still and breathed for a full 3 minutes while the suit's pain management system dumped mild analgesics into her bloodstream. And she stared at the orange sky of Vethkar through the hole where the viewport had been. The sky here was wrong. She'd known that from the sensor data. Vethkar's atmosphere had been altered by 3 years of hive terraforming, a slow, methodical conversion process that the xenobiologists called consumption, which Mara had always thought was an unusually honest word for what the hive did. The air was technically breathable by human standards, nitrogen, oxygen, trace gases. But the hive had added something else, a faint, sweet, almost floral scent that clung to everything, that the field manuals described as the byproduct of Vethkari biomass processing. The biologists called it the bloom. Everyone else called it what it was, the smell of a world being digested. She pulled herself upright, tested the fractured leg, decided she'd walked on worse, found a length of conduit that worked as a crutch, and limped to the hole in the hull and looked out. What she saw was not a planet. Or rather, it had been a planet once, and might be again. But right now it was something else entirely. The city below, and it had been a city, New Kesthaven, population 40,000, established 2187, had been consumed. That was the only word for it. The buildings remained, mostly. The streets remained. But everything was threaded through with hive biomass. The dark, fibrous, semi-translucent tissue that the Vethkari used to reshape every world they took. It grew over walls and through windows. It bridged the gaps between structures like the work of some vast and purposeful organism, which is exactly what it was. The city breathed. She could see it from here, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction, the entire colony rising and falling, on the hive's tidal respiration, and the sound, that wet, patient, rhythmic sound. She could hear it more clearly now. It was not one sound. It was thousands of them, layered and overlapping, a vast low chorus that rose from the city like a living thing. The sound of the hive feeding. On what, she did not yet know. She hoped it wasn't people. She climbed down from the wreckage with her makeshift crutch and her 11% neural implant, and her 6 hours of oxygen and the sidearm she found still holstered at her hip. A standard issue Hammerfeld 7, with 14 rounds in the magazine and 1 in the chamber, and she started toward the city. She had a reason to go toward it rather than away from it. Not a good reason, maybe, but a real one. The Harbinger's emergency transponder had been broadcasting her location on a rescue frequency since the crash. She'd confirmed that before leaving the wreck, but the nearest Ensk recovery station was 8 days out at best. She had 6 hours of suit oxygen. Vethkar's atmosphere was breathable. But the Bloom compound had demonstrated dose-dependent neurological effects in prolonged exposure, which the field manual described as behavioral modification, and which the veteran soldiers described with considerably more profanity. She needed to find a sealed structure. She needed water. She needed to understand what she'd landed in the middle of, and she needed to know if anyone was still alive down there. Because if there was one thing Mara Voss had learned in 12 years of fighting the hive across 7-star systems, it was that the Vethkari didn't just eat worlds. They kept things. They maintained collections, things that were still useful. The xenobiologists had a name for it. The larder. She found the first survivor approximately 40 minutes after leaving the wreck. He was old, perhaps 70, perhaps more. The kind of old that years of hard labor produce, rather than the soft erosion of comfortable aging. He was sitting at the base of a hive-threaded wall in what had once been a public square, wearing the remains of a colonial work coverall, and talking to himself in a low, urgent murmur. His eyes tracked to her as she approached, and something moved behind them. Something that might once have been alarm, or caution, or the ordinary animal wariness of a man who had survived 3 years on an occupied world. But it moved slowly, the way things move in deep water. "You're new," he said. "Just landed," Mara said. She kept her hand near the Hammerfeld. "What's your name?" "Snick," he said. And then after a pause, "That's what they call me now. I think I had another name once." He tilted his head. "You don't have a worm." "Not yet," Mara said. "They'll fix that," Snick said. He seemed to find this mildly amusing. "The collectors will find you. They always find the new ones. They can smell the bloom on you. When you breathe it, for the first time it leaves a marker. Like a fingerprint." He squinted at her. "Soldier. You're a soldier, I can tell." He paused. "We haven't had soldiers in a long time. The last soldiers died fast." "I'm not planning to die," Mara said. Snick looked at her the way old people look at young ones who haven't yet learned the particular lessons that age teaches. Not unkindly, but with a certain exhausted patience. "That's what the last soldiers said," he said. "Come, I'll show you where the clean water is, before the collectors find you." She didn't trust him entirely. She trusted him enough. In her experience, the most reliable people in occupied zones were always the ones who had been there longest, the ones who had survived by learning everything about the thing that was trying to kill them, who had made their accommodations with horror, and come out the other side, knowing exactly which accommodations were survivable and which were not. Snick was alive. After 3 years under the hive, that meant something. He led her through the threaded streets, with the practiced ease of someone who knew every patrol route and blind spot by heart. She watched him, the way he paused at certain corners, the way he seemed to listen with his whole body, the way he occasionally reached out and touched the hive mass on the walls, with something that wasn't quite tenderness, but wasn't revulsion either. It was the touch of familiarity, of long association. "The worm," she said, as they moved through the shadow of what had been a transit hub. "What does it do?" "Makes you calm," Snick said. "Makes you cooperative. Makes you want to go to the pattern chambers and give your contribution." He touched the back of his own neck. An unconscious gesture, she thought, or perhaps a habit. "I've had 3 of them. The first one I pulled out. That was a bad idea. The second one came out on its own when it was done. The third one, he stopped and turned to look at her. The third one I kept until it was ready. I know the difference now. The difference between what? Between what it takes from you and what you can keep, Snick said. Most people don't know. They give everything the first time. There's nothing left. What does it take from you? Mara asked. Exactly. He was quiet for a moment. Your pattern, he said. That's what the hive calls it. Your bioelectric signature. The specific frequency of your neural activity. Your emotional state. Your memories. Your fear. The queen feeds on it, not the biology. He paused, searching. The experience. What it feels like to be you. Mara thought about that. She's feeding on consciousness, she said. On what consciousness produces, Snick said. The worm harvests it while it lives in you. Then it returns to the queen. Then it comes back for more, if you have more to give. He paused. Humans have more to give than most species. That's why so many of us are still alive. We're a particularly rich source of pattern. Mara felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. She's keeping us alive because we're good food, she said. She's keeping us alive because she can't get enough of us, Snick said, and his voice carried something strange, something between exhaustion and a bitter, private pride. The Vethkari have been feeding on sentient species for 40,000 years. Galactic Council records, the old ones, from before the Council, decided the hive was too dangerous to study up close. They say the hive has absorbed the pattern of 412 species. Some of those species don't exist anymore. The hive took everything they were. He paused at a corner, listened, moved on. But no queen has ever fully consumed a human pattern. Not once, in 200 years of contact. We're the only species she keeps coming back to. He glanced at her. She doesn't know why, she can't compute it. And the Vethkari cannot rest with something they cannot compute. The clean water was in the lower basement of what had been a hospital, a storage tank, still sealed, that the hive had left intact because its contents were not organic and therefore not interesting. Snick had rigged a small purification system from salvaged medical equipment. There were 6 other people down there, 4 men, 2 women, ranging from perhaps 30 to perhaps 90, all wearing the remains of colonial civilian wear, all with the same deep-water quality in their eyes that Snick had. The slow-motion wariness of people who had been afraid for so long that fear had become the baseline state of existence. Mara introduced herself. Captain Mara Voss, UES Harbinger, 4th Expeditionary Fleet. She said it the way she always said it, not loudly, not with theater, just clearly. Each word placed with deliberate precision. It was something her first commanding officer had taught her. When you're in the worst situations, state who you are out loud, not for the people listening. For yourself. One of the women, younger than the rest, perhaps 35, with the careful watchfulness of someone who had spent 3 years cataloging everything that might kill her, sat up straighter when she heard it. 4th Expeditionary, she said. Chen's fleet? Was Chen's fleet? Mara said. We got ambushed. I don't know what's left. She paused. I'm sorry. The woman absorbed this. My name is Dara Fen, she said. I was a systems engineer for the colony. I've been mapping the hive's biomass distribution down here for 8 months. She hesitated. I have something you might want to see. The map was drawn on the back of a series of medical intake forms. Hundreds of them, overlapping, annotated in a precise, tiny hand that spoke of engineering training and the particular discipline of someone who knows that accurate information is the only thing standing between them and death. It covered the entire city and extended 2 kilometers beyond its boundaries. The hive mass was marked in red, colonial infrastructure. What remained of it, in black, the patrol routes of the collectors, the Vethkari worker caste, bipedal and quick, covered in the same dark fibrous material as the walls, were marked with arrows and times. And in the center of the map, in the place where the old administrative district had been, a structure unlike anything else on the diagram, larger than everything around it, the lines of hive mass converging on it from every direction in the city, like tributaries feeding a river, like roots feeding a tree. The pattern chamber, Dara said. That's what Snick calls it. I call it the Queen's Node. She traced a finger along the converging lines. Everything goes in here. All the pattern that the worms harvest, all of it goes to her. She looked at Mara. We think she's dormant, or something close to it. The collectors run the operations here. She doesn't direct them personally. She hasn't for at least 2 years. But they still harvest for her. They still maintain the node. Dara paused. We think they're waiting for something. Some threshold. Some amount of pattern that will be enough to wake her. Enough of what? Mara asked. Enough human pattern, Dara said. We think the ratio has been climbing. That's why they've been increasing the harvest rate these last 4 months. Something changed. She tapped the map. She woke up once, briefly, about 6 weeks ago. We could tell because all the collectors stopped moving simultaneously for about 40 seconds. Then they all started again. And after that, the harvest rate doubled. Mara stared at the map. She thought about what Snick had said, that no queen had ever fully consumed a human pattern. She thought about the xenobiology briefings she'd half slept through at the academy, the ones about hive cognitive architecture, about how Vethkari queens processed assimilated genetic and neural data. She thought about the way the bloom smelled, sweet and wrong, like something's biological, trying to imitate something that could only be described, not synthesized. She's trying to understand us, Mara said. Or trying to become us, Dara said quietly. The silence in the basement had weight. She won't like what she finds, Mara said. Nobody laughed. But Snick, sitting against the far wall, made a sound that might charitably be described as a smile. The worm found Mara 4 hours later. She'd gone up to the first floor to check sight lines. She needed to understand the patrol patterns from ground level, rather than on a map. And she'd been careless for approximately 3 seconds, which was all it took. She heard a soft sound behind her, turned, and the collector was there in the doorway, small and fast and completely silent. And before she could bring up the Hammerfeld, it had deployed the delivery organ from the fold beneath its jaw, and the worm was inside her collar. And, moving before she could register it as separate events, it was not painful. That was the worst part. She felt it enter, a cold, thin, purposeful movement along the back of her neck. And then, a spreading warmth that was chemically distinct from natural warmth. Engineered warmth. The warmth of a thing that wanted her to be calm and cooperative and willing. She shot the collector. 3 rounds, center mass. It went down without making a sound. She stood still for a moment. The warmth spread. She waited. And then, slowly, she became aware that something was wrong with the warmth. Not wrong in a way that was causing her pain. Wrong in a way that suggested the warmth was confused. She could feel the worm adjusting, recalibrating, sending slightly different chemical signals as if searching for the right frequency. She'd had xenobiology training. She knew what the compliance hormone was supposed to do to human neurochemistry. Bind to the same receptors as serotonin and oxytocin, flood the system with artificial calm, suppress the fight-or-flight response, make the host cooperative. The problem, she realized, was cortisol. She had been afraid and furious and operating on 4 hours of broken sleep in a crashed warship on an occupied world for approximately 6 hours. Her system was absolutely saturated with cortisol, adrenaline, norepinephrine, the full biochemical cocktail of extreme sustained stress. And whatever the hive's compliance hormone was designed to do, it had not been designed to do it in a system already running on a full combat load of human stress chemistry. The two systems were fighting each other. She could feel it, not as pain exactly, but as a strange doubled quality of awareness, as if she were observing herself from a slight distance, as if someone had turned up the resolution on her perceptions without her permission. She was not calm. She was not cooperative. She was, if anything, more alert than before. She thought, this is what Snick meant. This is what they can't compute. She went back downstairs. There's a worm in me, she told the group. Snick looked at her the way a man looks at weather he's seen before. Yes. I heard the shot. Are you? I'm fine, Mara said. I'm more than fine. She held up her right hand. Steady. Whatever it's supposed to do, it's not doing it. Not the way it's supposed to. She paused. Dara, I need your map. And I need to know everything you know about the Queen's node. The structure, the access points, any weak points in the biomass. Dara stared at her for a moment. Then she went and got the map. What Mara was thinking as she spread it on the floor and began studying it was not a plan yet. It was something more preliminary, the raw material that plans are made from. It was the accumulated product of 12 years of fighting the Vethkari across systems and sectors, of studying their architecture and their biology and their decision-making logic, of sitting in too many debriefs about why things went wrong and not enough about why they occasionally went right. It was the knowledge that the hive was, in every important sense, a single organism, that its power and its weakness were the same thing, that a hive mind's greatest advantage was its perfect coordination, and its greatest vulnerability was the same. It had never, in 40,000 years of conquest, needed to account for an adversary that didn't coordinate the way it did, an adversary that made decisions for reasons the hive couldn't model, an adversary that ran on a biochemistry so chaotic and self-contradictory that even their own compliance system couldn't get clean purchase on it. How many collectors in the city? She asked. We've counted approximately 400, Dara said. Maybe a third of those are on active patrol at any given time. The rest are in the node or in the processing structures. The node, Mara said. When you say she woke up for 40 seconds, is she continuous? Is there always some level of active processing happening? We don't know. We think there are periods of lower activity. We've observed the collectors as moving more slowly, covering smaller areas, during what we think are her dormancy cycles. They coincide with the local night, roughly. How long until local night? Dara checked her salvage timepiece. Approximately 4 hours. I need to know how to get to the node without being seen, Mara said. The room went quiet. Not the quiet of refusal, the quiet of people reassessing what they'd assumed the situation was. Mara had met this quiet before, in briefing rooms, after she'd proposed something that the people in those rooms had dismissed as impossible until they realized she'd thought through the parts they hadn't considered. It had a particular texture to it, that quiet, part shock, part calculation, part the very tentative beginning of something that wasn't quite hope, but rhymed with it. You're going to the node, said the old man in the corner. She hadn't gotten his name yet. He said it flat, not as a question. I'm going to the node, Mara said. With what? She looked at the Hammerfeld on her hip. 11 rounds. She looked at the conduit crutch she'd been using since the crash. She looked at the hospital basement around her, at the medical equipment Dara had salvaged, at the storage shelves, still half-stocked with industrial-grade cleaning compounds and disinfectants, and at least 2 canisters of the concentrated bacteriostatic agent that colonial medical facilities used to sterilize surgical environments. I'll improvise, she said. Snick made the sound again, the one that might have been a smile. You're like the dead one, he said. The one we couldn't understand. Which dead one? Kai, Dara said. She was watching Mara with an expression that was difficult to read. One of the original colonists. He died early in the occupation. The collectors killed him, or thought they had. But he kept getting up, kept moving, kept killing collectors. They couldn't understand it. The hive's sensory system reads bioelectric signatures to assess threat status. If a target registers as dead or dying, they deprioritize it. But he registered as dead and kept functioning. She paused. They eventually destroyed him, but it took them nearly 2 years, and it cost them significant resources. The Queen studied his pattern for months afterward. What did she conclude? Mara asked. We don't know, Dara said, but we know she never reached a conclusion. The study is still ongoing, we think. She paused. She can't compute death that keeps moving. Mara thought about that for a long moment. Can I see his file? She asked. There was no file. What there was Dara's memory. She'd known Kai, briefly, in the first months of the occupation. She described him the way people describe the dead when they're trying to be fair to them. Carefully, selecting details, leaving out the ones that didn't serve the truth of the person. A quiet man, she said, careful. Not the kind of person you'd call a fighter before the hive came, but the kind who discovered what they were when there was no other option. The kind who knew that the worst thing you could do in a situation that wanted you to be afraid was let the fear come out in the wrong direction. He used to hum, Dara said, when he was working on something difficult. Just to himself. Some old tune. I never knew what it was. Did it bother anyone? Mara asked. It bothered the collectors, Dara said. They'd pause when they heard it. Like it interfered with something. We thought it was just a startle response at first. But it happened too consistently. The hive processes pattern partly through harmonic resonance. There's some xenobiology literature on it. Certain frequency patterns in human vocalization are apparently, she searched for the word, dissonant, Snick offered. Dissonant, Dara agreed, to the hive's perception system. Like static. Mara absorbed this. Huh, she said. She started going through the medical shelves. The bacteriostatic agent, trade name Steraphos, colony-grade formula, was at full concentration a powerful oxidizing compound. It was designed to denature proteins, destroy bacterial membranes, render organic tissue non-viable. At the concentrations needed for surgical sterilization, it was harmless to human skin with brief exposure. At 5 times that concentration, applied directly to hive biomass, which was, at its structural level, an enormously complex organic polymer matrix. It should, in theory, cause rapid depolymerization. The matrix would break down. The tissue would dissolve. In theory, the old man in the corner. His name was Gris. She eventually learned. Had a background in chemical engineering. He looked at what she was proposing with the expression of a man who has made peace with the idea that theory and practice are 2 different countries, and that she seemed determined to travel between them without a visa. It might work, he said. The biomass is not so different from the bacterial matrices it's designed for. At the molecular level, you'd need delivery pressure to get it to penetrate the outer layer. He paused. We have 3 irrigation pump units in the surgical storage. They run on compressed gas cartridges. Another pause. You realize this is less of a plan and more of a direction. That's what most plans are, Mara said, until they stop being. It took 90 minutes to rig the 3 pump units into something that could be carried and operated with one hand. The fractured shin was causing her real problems now. The analgesic in her suit had worn down with the battery, and she'd switched to sheer stubbornness, which was a less elegant system, but had the advantage of running on a fuel source that was effectively inexhaustible. Gris worked alongside her, not because she'd asked him to, but because he'd apparently decided that the question of whether to participate had resolved itself somewhere in the last hour without requiring his explicit input. He didn't say much. Neither did she. They worked the way people work, when they understand what the other person is doing and know that commentary won't improve it. The worm shifted occasionally at the back of her neck. She could feel it adjusting, still trying to find the right biochemical channel, still failing. She had started to think of it not as a parasite but as a radio, trying to tune to a station that kept moving. There was something almost companionable about its persistence. She'd had worse company. Dara had spent the 90 minutes refining her patrol route map for the specific corridors between the hospital and the node. She'd also found, in the hospital's records archive, a sealed server unit that the hive hadn't bothered to access, apparently not recognizing it as a source of pattern. The colony's original structural plans for the administrative district. The node had been built into the district's central power facility. That meant conduit access. That meant maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the street level, and therefore beneath the collector patrols. There's one problem, Dara said, showing her the route on the map. The maintenance tunnel system doesn't reach the node itself. The closest access point comes out in the mechanical room of the building, adjacent to the central power facility. From there, It's approximately 30 meters of open street, all of which is within sensor range of at least 4 collector patrol routes. How long is the exposure window? Mara asked. Between patrols, about 11 seconds. That's fine, Mara said. Dara stared at her. 11 seconds. I run faster than I look, Mara said. Your leg is not a reason. Not harshly. It's a variable. She let the silence sit for a moment. Then, because it seemed like the right thing to say, I've been doing this for 12 years. Not this exact thing, but this general category of thing. And I want to be honest with all of you about what the outcome of tonight might be. She looked around the room, Snick, Dara, Gris, the others. 6 people. 6 people who had survived 3 years of the worst thing humanity had encountered in 2 centuries of space travel, who had mapped patrol routes and built water purification systems and maintained, against all reasonable odds, the specific human capacity for being alive and present in a situation that wanted them to stop being either. I might not come back. The most likely outcome of what I'm about to do is that I don't come back. I want you to know that I know that. And I'm going anyway, because there's a transmitter in the Harbinger's wreck that's been broadcasting a rescue beacon since I crashed. And in 8 days, a UNS recovery team is going to show up in this system. And what I want to do tonight is make sure that when they get here, there's something left for them to find. Something that made their arrival possible rather than just pointless. She paused. Also, she said, I don't particularly like the hive. Snick made the sound for the 3rd time. This time it was unmistakably a laugh. Go, he said. Before the night cycle ends. She went. The maintenance tunnels were exactly as awful as she'd expected. Cramped, dark, threaded with thin strands of hive biomass that she cut through with the edge of the conduit crutch rather than touch with her hands. Her breathing echoing back at her from the low ceiling. The 3 pump units strapped across her back, adding weight to a body that was already operating below specifications. The fractured shin sang steadily. She filed it under acceptable inputs and kept moving. The worm was quiet now. It had stopped adjusting. She wasn't sure whether that meant it had given up or was waiting for something. She'd decided, somewhere in the last hour, that it didn't matter. Whatever it was reporting to the Queen's node, it was reporting on a human being in the middle of a sustained acute stress response, operating on inadequate sleep and inadequate nutrition, and with a compromised limb, making a series of decisions that no hive war logic system could have predicted, because the decisions were not the product of logic. They were the product of something else, the specific, strange, often self-defeating, and yet occasionally magnificent human capacity to do something, because it mattered, because it was right, because the alternative was to be the kind of person who let the wrong thing happen when there was still a chance to do something about it. She thought about what Dara had said about Kai humming. She thought about it, and then, very quietly, she started to hum. She didn't know what she was humming, exactly. Something her grandmother had sung, or a song from a film she'd seen as a child, or something she'd assembled from half-remembered fragments, in the way that minds do in the dark. It was slow and low, and had a particular quality that she couldn't describe in musical terms, only in terms of what it felt like. The feeling of something ordinary, in the middle of something impossible. The feeling of having a self that existed before and outside of the situation, trying to consume it. She heard something change in the biomass around her as she hummed. A kind of vibration, a tension, as if the material was responding to a frequency it hadn't been designed to process. She hummed louder. She emerged from the maintenance access point in the mechanical room of the adjacent building, with 43 seconds to spare before the next patrol rotation. The room was 3 meters by 4, full of climate control machinery that the hive had incorporated into its own temperature regulation system. The machine still ran, she noted, just for different purposes now. The hive was remarkably pragmatic about what it repurposed. It never destroyed anything that still worked. It just redirected it. She unslung the pump units and checked the seals. Good. She checked the compressed gas cartridges. Good. She stood at the edge of the doorway and watched the street beyond. The node was 30 meters away, and it was enormous. She had known, from the map, that it was large. She had not been prepared for large in the physical, immediate sense. The sense in which a thing you've been told is enormous suddenly exists in front of you and is enormous in a way that data never quite communicates. The original power facility had been a 4-story building. The node had grown from it like a tumor, or like a flower, depending on your aesthetic, expanding upward and outward in the dark fibrous architecture of the hive until it was perhaps 12 stories tall and wider than the original structure by a factor of 3. It pulsed, slowly, rhythmically, almost gently. The tributaries of biomass from across the city converged at its base and entered through orifices that opened and closed with the same rhythm, feeding it in steady streams. The whole thing had a dim internal bioluminescence, a deep orange-red that suggested heat, that suggested something very much alive and very much active. It was beautiful in the way that dangerous things sometimes are, in the way that tells you the beauty is incidental, that whatever is producing it isn't thinking about aesthetics, that it exists for other purposes entirely, and that beauty is just a side effect of those purposes being executed with perfect efficiency. She watched the patrol routes, accounted, measured, weighted. Second, she ran. The fractured shin produced a sensation that she declined to experience as pain. She covered the 30 meters in what felt like less than 11 seconds and arrived at the base of the node, breathing hard, her back against the fibrous outer wall, listening. No alarm, no response. The patrol had passed, would not return for another 4 minutes by Dara's calculations. She had 4 minutes to find an access point. She found it in 40 seconds, a seam in the outer wall where 2 growth planes had not fully fused, leaving a gap approximately 60 centimeters wide at its widest point. The interior glow pulsed through it. She could feel heat. She worked the first pump unit off her back, checked the pressure, and pushed the nozzle into the gap. The compound hit the inner wall with a faint hissing sound and a smell that cut through the bloom like a blade. Sharp, chemical, aggressive. She could see the reaction immediately. The fibrous material where the compound landed began to pale, to lose its structural integrity, to separate into something that was no longer solid. The gap widened. She moved to the second pump unit. Inside the node, something changed. She felt it before she heard it. A change in the rhythm of the pulsing, a hitch, as if a heart had missed a beat, then a sound she hadn't heard before. A low, resonant frequency, below the threshold of normal hearing, that she felt more in her chest than her ears. The bioluminescence intensified. She pushed through the gap. The interior of the node was a cathedral. There was no other word for it. The scale and the light and the quality of space created exactly the feeling that word was invented to describe, minus the divinity. The central chamber rose the full 12 stories, the walls covered in dense hive biomass that ran in vertical columns from floor to ceiling, each column pulsing with the orange-red bioluminescence, each one thick with the fine filaments that were, she now understood, the neural architecture of the collective, the physical substrate of the Queen's distributed cognition. Thousands of filaments, millions, converging toward the center of the chamber where she was. The Queen was not what Mara had expected. The xenobiology briefings described Bethkari queens as massive, stationary, the hub of the hive mind's physical expression. Enormous organisms that the collective body had grown around, that directed the swarm through the biomass network, that served as their nervous system extended into the world. She had expected something that looked like a queen, something that communicated power through scale and form. What she found instead was a shape. It had started as a Vethkari queen. She could see the original form in its underlying structure, the bilateral symmetry, the multiple sensory arrays, the central processing mass that served as its primary cognition, but it had grown. It had incorporated, over years of processing human pattern, years of feeding on the neural signatures and the emotional bioelectric output, and the specific frequency of Human consciousness, it had changed. The queen had been absorbing human pattern for so long, feeding on human experience with such appetite and intensity, that the absorption had gone both ways. She had not just consumed what she harvested, she had been shaped by it. The form was wrong in ways that the hive's natural biology could not account for, growing in directions that Vethkari biology did not grow, expressing structures that had no functional analog in the species' evolutionary history. She had hands. Not human hands, exactly. The proportions were wrong, the joints too many, the fingers too long, but the attempt was unmistakable. Two of them, emerging from the anterior mass, reaching forward, as if toward something. The gesture was achingly familiar. She had eyes, not optical organs. Vethkari queens processed light through their sensory array, not dedicated visual organs. These were different. These were forward-facing, binocular, sized and positioned for the specific visual processing niche that the human nervous system had evolved for. She had grown herself a human way of seeing. She was conscious, not dormant, not cycling through a lower state. She was awake, and she was aware that Mara was here, and she was looking at her with eyes she had grown herself out of the specific experience of human perception. Mara did not lower the pump unit. The queen's cognition interface, the organ by which Vethkari queens communicated with their swarm, was not designed for direct interspecies communication. But 3 years of processing human pattern had done something to it, the same way it had done something to everything else. A sound came from it, shaped sound, modulated, structured, not speech, not exactly, but something that had learned the shape of speech from the inside, that carried the emotional architecture of communication, the way a translation retains the structure of the original language. It said, in something that was not quite words. "You are afraid," Mara said. And then, "But you came anyway." "Yes," she said again. A long pause in the pulsing of the chamber. The filaments moved slowly in patterns she couldn't read. "I have consumed the pattern of many," it said, or communicated, or expressed. She didn't have the vocabulary for what it was doing. She had no word for that category of transmission. "I have consumed the living experience of 431 species. I have understood their fear, their comfort, their ending, their desire for continuation. I have taken all of it into my architecture. I understand all of it." "I know," Mara said. "I cannot understand you." The weight in that phrase was extraordinary. She had expected many things from this encounter, and she had not expected sorrow. "I know," she said again. "I have consumed your pattern in fragment, in piece, in sample," she said. "I have consumed the final emotional states of your kind as they ended. I have consumed memory and fear, and the sound of your breath, and the chemical signature of your grief. I have attempted reconstruction. I have attempted synthesis. The hands, the two impossible human-adjacent hands, moved, reaching further forward, then stopping. I cannot complete the model," she said. "I cannot find the terminal point. Your kind extends in a direction I have no architecture to process. In every other pattern I have consumed, the consumption is complete. Reach the edge of the organism, and there is an edge. With your kind, there is no edge. Every point of termination opens onto another point. Every moment of ending is also a moment of continuation. I cannot find the boundary of what you are." Mara thought about this for a long time. She thought about Kai, humming to himself in the ruins of a city that was trying to eat him. She thought about Snick, sitting in a public square after 3 years of occupation, with something that was not quite a smile and not quite a curse, but functioned as both. She thought about Dara cataloging patrol routes on the backs of medical intake forms because the information was real, and the information might help, and that was reason enough. She thought about the old man Gris, deciding without being asked that if someone was trying to do something impossible, they might as well have a chemical engineer helping them rig the device. She thought about Reyes on the Harbinger's bridge, screaming something she couldn't make out in the moment before everything went dark. She thought about the fact that she was standing in the cognitive center of a hive queen on an occupied world, with a pump unit full of depolymerizing compound and 11 rounds in her sidearm, and a fractured shin and a parasite in the back of her neck, and the queen was telling her that human beings were somehow incomputable, and she was trying to decide whether that was the most terrifying thing she'd ever heard, or the most encouraging, and she was slowly coming to the conclusion that it was both simultaneously, which was perhaps the most human conclusion possible. That's because we're not a single pattern, she said. We're a process. We don't end because the pattern doesn't end. It just changes shape. It moves through us and past us, and we carry it forward. She paused. We grieve. We remember. We tell stories about the dead. We name things. We hum tunes our mothers taught us in the dark. The pattern doesn't complete because we don't let it complete. The queen was still for a long time. Then slowly, in a direction that the chamber's bioluminescence could not quite track, she turned away, and Mara understood that this was not submission, and it was not defeat, and it was not the queen deciding that humanity was beyond her reach. It was the queen recognizing a fundamental incompatibility, recognizing that what she had been attempting, the full consumption and integration of human pattern, was not a project that could ever resolve, that the thing she wanted to understand was precisely the thing that made it impossible to understand, that she could consume fragments forever and never reach completion, and she was going to direct the swarm to try again. Mara raised the pump unit. What happened next took 37 seconds and was not glorious. It was not a hero's moment in the cinematic sense. She moved through the chamber as fast as the fractured shin would allow, which was fast enough, targeting the primary filament, columns, the neural architecture, the substrate of the queen's distributed processing, the physical material that allowed the queen to maintain her cognition. The compound depolymerized it wherever it made contact, the filaments dissolving, the connections and breaking, the bioluminescent glow sputtering and failing in sections as the neural network lost coherence. The queen did not fight her. She was not certain whether this was because the queen could not, or because the queen had, in the final computation, arrived at the only conclusion that human pattern would always produce in an adversary that tried to consume it, that there are some things that resist consumption, precisely because they are worth consuming, and that the attempt to devour them will always cost you more than they will ever yield. She used all 3 pump units. She used the Hammerfeld on the central mass, not to kill it. She knew 11 rounds wouldn't kill it, but to sever the specific structural connections between the primary processing node and the peripheral network. 412 species, 431. She thought about every one of those species, every one that had ended on the far side of a queen's appetite, every pattern that had been consumed completely and with finality. The chamber went dark, not all at once. In sections, the bioluminescent sets fading from orange-red to orange to yellow to nothing, the pulsing slowing, the rhythm failing, the tributaries of biomass along the walls going still, and then beginning the slow, visible process of depolymerization that the compound triggered in hive tissue. Not burning, nothing so dramatic, just a gradual loss of structural integrity, a softening, a return to component chemistry. In the dark, she heard the queen make one final sound. It was not in any language she could name. It was not communication in any sense she had training for. It was more fundamental than language, older, more basic, the kind of sound that exists below the architecture of meaning and carries meaning anyway. She didn't know what it was, exactly, only what it felt like. It felt like something that had been trying to understand something for a very long time and had finally understood enough to know that it never would. She thought, though she couldn't say why, that it might have been beautiful, in its way. She turned and limped back out through the gap in the outer wall. Outside, the city was different. She felt it before she could see what was different about it. A change in the quality of the air, a change in the sound, a change in the way the spaces between the buildings related to each other. The low, patient, rhythmic eating sound had stopped. The hive mass on the walls and the roads, and the bridging structures between buildings, had gone still. The collector patrols she'd seen on Dara's map had halted. She could see 3 of them from where she stood. All stopped in place, standing with the particular quality of stillness that very complex systems produce. When the system that directs them suddenly stops directing, it wouldn't last. She knew enough about hive architecture to know that individual collectors had autonomous behavioral protocols that would eventually reassert. And the queen herself was damaged, not destroyed. The processing network was compromised, but the biology remained. It would begin rebuilding. It might take months. It might take years, but it would begin. It was enough. She had done enough. The transmitter in the Harbinger's wreck was broadcasting. In 8 days, 7 now, 7 and some hours, a UNX recovery team would arrive in this system. Now when they arrived, they would find a population of survivors in a city where the hive's organizational coherence had been disrupted, where the collector patrols were running on degraded autonomous protocols, where the neural network that made the hive efficient and coordinated and overwhelming had been knocked back to something that a prepared assault force could deal with. Not easy. Nothing about the hive was ever easy, but possible. She started back toward the hospital. The streets were strange in the hive mass silence. She'd gotten used to the sound without noticing. The eating, breathing, digesting sound of an occupied world. And now that it was gone, she kept listening for it, kept noticing its absence, the way you notice the absence of a sound that has become background, that you only register by missing it. The orange sky was paling toward what passed for dawn here. The biomass on the walls was still, but had a different quality now. A slight translucence where it had been opaque, a softening at the edges. It was not dead, but it was no longer fully directed. She was 3 blocks from the hospital when the worm moved. Not the adjustment and recalibration movement she'd been feeling all night. Something different. Something that felt for the first time like retreat. The cold, thin, purposeful sensation running backward. Not the invasion, but the reverse of it. The worm withdrawing in the same direction it had come, slipping back along the path it had traced through her nervous system, and then gone. She stood still for a moment, reached up and felt the back of her neck. Nothing there, she thought. The queen was the anchor. Without the queen's network to return to, the worm had nowhere to deliver its pattern. Without a destination, a harvest organism becomes something without purpose, and a thing without purpose in a biological system doesn't linger. It leaves, she thought. That's an interesting property. We should study that. She filed it in the part of her mind where she kept things that needed to be reported, and kept moving. Snick was waiting at the entrance to the hospital's mechanical room, which meant he'd been watching the node. He looked at her for a long moment, at the pump units, empty, at the hammerfeld, at the fractured shin she was no longer using the conduit crutch for, because somewhere in the last 2 blocks she'd decided she didn't need it, and it had turned out to be correct, and he nodded. The nod of someone who expected a thing to happen, and then had to decide what to do with the experience of watching it actually happen. The sound stopped, he said. Yes, she said. All of it, he said. The whole city. For now, she said. It'll come back. But not the same way. Not for a while. She paused. There's a rescue beacon broadcasting from my ship. We have approximately 7 days before a recovery team arrives. I want to spend that time preparing this population for extraction. Snick looked at her for a long time. There are more survivors, he said. Not just us. There are groups across the city. Maybe 150, 200 people total. We have communication systems, crude ones. We've been afraid to use them because the collectors could track the signals. He paused. The collectors are standing still. Use them, Mara said. Now tonight. Tell everyone to move toward the hospital. Tell them what happened. She stopped. Tell them the killing has stopped. Tell them someone is coming to get them. He went inside. She stood at the entrance for a moment, looking at the city. The orange sky was brightening. The biomass was still. 300 meters away, a collector stood in the middle of what had been a transit hub, its sensor arrays slowly moving through their automated sweep cycle, with the vacant, methodical quality of a machine whose instructions have been suspended without being replaced. It was not looking for her. It was not looking for anything. It was executing its baseline protocol, because that was what it was designed to do in the absence of direction. She had done something tonight that would need to be understood, need to be documented, need to be added to the body of knowledge about how the hive could be fought, and how it could be hurt, and what its vulnerabilities actually were, rather than what the briefings described them as. The queen's absorption problem, the compliance hormone and human cortisol, the harmonic dissonance, the thing about boundary conditions. The queen had said it with something like sorrow, and Mara had understood it as something like strength, and the gap between those two interpretations was exactly the gap that the hive had never been able to cross, the gap between a species that consumed experience and a species that lived it. She thought about the hands. The queen had grown herself human hands, reaching forward, because the thing she was trying to grasp required a different kind of reaching than she'd been built for. She thought, we should tell the xenobiologists about, she thought. They're going to have a lot of questions. She went inside. Dara was sitting at the water tank with her map spread out in front of her, not looking at the map, looking at the middle distance, with an expression that suggested she was waiting for the final variable in a long calculation to resolve. When Mara came through the door, she looked up, and the expression shifted, not to relief exactly, because relief requires that you've been afraid of the alternative. And Dara had the kind of self-possession that didn't allow that particular type of emotional accounting. It was something cleaner than relief, something closer to the specific satisfaction of a thing you've been working on for a long time finally showing signs of working. Snick is on the comm, she said. I think you should know, he's not the person he was 3 years ago. None of us are. But tonight, she paused. I heard him laugh, she said. For the first time, a real one. She folded the map with the careful precision of someone who has been folding it for 8 months and knows exactly where each crease goes. I think that might mean something. It does, Mara said. She sat down on the floor next to the water tank because her shin had finally run out of its willingness to be ignored. And she was very tired. And there was time now for tired. 7 days was a long time. 7 days was long enough for everything that needed to happen before the ships arrived. But right now, in the next hour, she would allow the tiredness. She put her back against the tank and her head against the wall, and she listened to Snick's voice through the crude comm system carrying across the silent city to wherever the survivors were hiding, saying in the plain, direct way of someone who had learned to say exactly what he meant, and nothing more. It's safe now. Come out. Someone is on their way. Gris brought her water without being asked. The unnamed man in the corner had acquired a name, she'd learned. Tobias. He was watching her with the particular expression of someone reassessing their prior probability estimates in real time, which she found more comfortable than being looked at like a hero. Which was the other thing that sometimes happened after something like this. She was not a hero. She was a captain who had made a series of decisions under bad conditions and gotten lucky in a few ways, and unlucky in fewer ways than she'd expected. And the rest was training and stubbornness, which were more reliable than luck, but not categorically different from it. The Galactic Council, she said, because it had been in her head since the Queen spoke. They know about the hive's pattern feeding. They've known for decades. They classified the files. Yes, Dara said. Because if the member species knew that the hive fed on consciousness, fed specifically on the experience of being sentient, it would destabilize. The Council, Mara said, because there's no diplomatic solution to that. There's no treaty. There's no containment that the hive would accept, because what they feed on is precisely what makes intelligent species worth interacting with. The Council's position, Dara said carefully, is that the hive represents a threat of unmanageable scale that requires. The Council's position, Mara said, is that humans are inconvenient because we keep fighting anyway. She paused. The Velcathari delegation raised it in session. I know. I read the summaries. They said human military engagement with the Hive was destabilizing, that we were provoking escalation. She leaned her head back against the tank. The Queen told me she can't complete our pattern, that there's no boundary to what we are. Do you understand what that means strategically? Dara looked at her steadily. Tell me. It means we're the only species she can't consume, Mara said. The only species she can feed on indefinitely without reaching completion. The only species whose pattern, by its own nature, resists total assimilation. She paused. We're not incidentally her target. We're her final target. We're the thing she's been building toward for 40,000 years. Every other species was practice. She paused again. And we're the only species equipped to matter. The Council won't want to hear that, Dara said. The Council, Mara said, is going to hear it, anyway. Outside, the first light of local dawn was coming through the hospital's high windows. Thin, orange-tinged, filtered through an atmosphere that smelled of the bloom, but carried, underneath it, the neutral mineral scent of a planet that was still, underneath everything that had been done to it itself, Veth-Kar, a colonial world, 112,000 registered inhabitants, 12,000 years of geological time before the first colony ship arrived, and 12,000 more ahead, regardless of what any species decided to do with it. She could hear voices in the streets outside, careful voices. The voices of people who had learned to be careful and had not yet fully learned to stop being careful. Moving toward the hospital, following the comm signal. Survivors, her people. Tobias had started to cry, very quietly, which he seemed surprised by, as if the emotion had arrived without invitation, and he wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. Gris put a hand on his shoulder and said nothing, because nothing was the right thing to say. Mara sat and listened to the city, filling back up with people. She thought about the Queen's hands, reaching forward, not quite, right, grown from the wrong kind of knowing, seeking something they would never quite hold. She thought about the incompleteness, and what it cost, and what it meant. She thought about Kai, dead and still fighting. 2 years of it. She thought about the she'd been humming in the tunnel, and wondered what it was, and decided it didn't matter. She thought about the 43 ships in the 4th Expeditionary Fleet that were not the Harbinger, and what had survived the ambush, and who among them was in a position to receive a report about what she'd learned tonight, and what they would do with it. She thought about a Galactic Council chamber she'd never sat in, and a table with 47 species around it, and the specific look that the Velkthari ambassador would give when a human walked in, and put evidence on the table that not only changed the calculus of the war, but retroactively changed the meaning of every engagement in the past 200 years. She thought, they are going to underestimate us again. They always do. They look at us, and they see the biology, the short lifespans, the non-augmented baseline, the emotional volatility, the irrational attachment to dead people, and lost causes and hopeless situations. They see all of that, and they calculate us as a minor species, a marginal force, an inconvenient variable in a much larger equation. They never see the math they're missing. They never see that the emotional volatility and the attachment to lost causes and the willingness to stay in a fight that has no rational outcome are not bugs in the human system. They are the system. They are the thing that the Hive Queen, in 40,000 years of consumption, in the processing of 431 species collective consciousness, in the patient and encyclopedic and ultimately incomplete attempt to understand the thing that human pattern produces. They are the thing she could not eat. Because you cannot consume a pattern that keeps generating new versions of itself. Because you cannot complete a model of a species that is defined by incompletion, by the reach toward what is not yet reached, by the grief for what is lost, and the stubborn conviction that the loss is worth carrying, by the hum in the dark, and the fractured shin, and the 13 rounds, and the decision to go toward, rather than away, when the rational calculation said otherwise. You cannot eat what won't stop becoming. Mara Voss, Captain, UES Harbinger, 4th Expeditionary Fleet, sat against a water tank in the basement of a hospital on a world that had been eaten and was not finished yet. And outside, the survivors were coming home, and 7 days from now the ships would come. And she was very tired, and she was very alive, and the sun was coming up. She closed her eyes. She started to hum.